My goal in this, whether you use Inspire or not, I want to talk through how we actually structure a lesson, why we structure it that way, and then how that relates to the things we talked about today. Student discourse, instructional routine, differentiation, mastery learning. So if you're not using Inspire, do I have anybody in here not using Inspire Science? Yes. If you're not, the things we're going to talk about that we included, you can do in any science lesson. We've just incorporated them into the material, but those ideas are the things that you can take away and use regardless of the class. The other thing I would tell you is this. I'm going to give you some examples from the middle grades mainly. Those can go down and up, okay? And it will tie exactly to those things that we've talked about. So you guys mind, we'll go ahead and get started? We've kind of already started, haven't we? Okay? I want to take you into this. Just so you know, Inspire Science is a K-12 program. And let me see if this is going to work. There we go. K1 to 5, one thing we do is we already build in some differentiated resources, because one of the hardest things for a teacher to do is to create them on your own. So one thing you'll notice, a little bit different at K1 than 2-5 because of the reading ability. So with the topics, you're going to have the read alouds and the different leveled readers. One thing we do with this, the thing I like about these for K5, this is on animal senses. Every student is reading about the same topic, but the reading level is different. So it really is a support to do that. The next thing at 6-8, by the way, K8, the lessons are structured the same way, the complexity goes up. And then at 9-12, we have the variety of science, and these we don't do in a write-in, we actually do it in a hardbound. A lot of the pedagogy, though, we still build into the same, and that's really what I spend our time. We're going to take about 25 minutes, and I want to look at these three things. And again, just remember, as we talk about it, I'll kind of reference this, but there's ways you can adapt for your classroom, regardless of what program you're using, for those kind of strategies we did. So one thing you know, in the American system, we operate off the NGSS standards. For our science teachers at home, it was a major shift, just like Common Core for math was, and just like Common Core for literacy. What we did is the part of the standard all of us are used to is this part right here. This is the content. An atom is made of 3 particles. What are those particles? Proton, electron, neutron. What kind of charge they have? How do those charges interact? What happens? All of that is the content. But what we did is we broke out 2 other aspects of the standard. The first one is the science and engineering practices. And really, guys, this is how we do science. It's what we do that makes science meaningful and how we experiment. So one of them is we create investigations in order to look at things. One, we use data and analyze data to come up with ideas. Okay? That's what those practices are about. One of the practices on models, how we model things. Yes, because, but I will tell you this, all of us have done models before, okay? In science class, does anybody remember doing a model of the cell? Okay, everyone, right? And what that model did is it actually helped students understand how a cell was made up. We've had students do models of atoms and models of the solar system and all those things. Really what NGSS is talking about with a model, though, is let's take that cell that we make and now let's pull out the endoplasmic reticulum. What happens? And why? Because the point of the model is to say what happens if. So let's think if there was a virus that actually inserted its DNA into the cell DNA and it quit making endoplasmic reticulum, what would happen to the cell and why? And so it's understanding that. That's what they mean by model. And then the third part of this is the cross-cutting concepts. This is the hardest one to me for teachers and students to get their mind around. Because we're the one subject, if we teach science, you know, if you teach math, you're just going to math class for students. It doesn't matter if it's Algebra 1 or Geometry or 7, it's just all math, right? When you're in English, not when I say English, let's say literature, it's just literature class. It doesn't matter what grade level. But once we get to high school, we don't go to science class. We go to biology, or we go to chemistry, or we go to physics. And what happened because of that is many of our students think chemistry is totally separate from biology. It's totally separate from physics. And really what we know is all the sciences are connected. So they came up with 7 cross-cutting themes to help students understand these themes go across all science. And some examples of that are structure and function. The structure creates the function. You can take that in any area of science. So like if you think of in physics, okay, the design and the forces in an atom determine what the structure is, but that structure then determines the function. And if you think about it, if you go into physics and think about levers, and then you look at our body, do we have any levers in our body? Yes. I mean, we have a fulcrum right here, okay? We have them all through our hands. We have them all over. But you know what? Students don't make those connections. So what we tried to do with this is to help these themes go across. So structure and function is one, energy is one, patterns is one. What do we do with patterns? The more we see a pattern, the more we can start to draw a hypothesis of what's happening. So we break the standards up like that. Now, in the actual standard itself, I'm just going to give you an example of this. We've got one up here, plan an investigation to determine the relationships among either the energy transferred, the type of matter, the mass, and the change in the average kinetic energy of the particles as measured by a temperature in the sample. Boy, isn't that exciting for a student? But what I want you to notice in the standard from a teacher perspective, do you see the first part where it's blue? Plan an investigation. That's the science and engineering practice we're going to be using. The green part, relationships, that's the cross-cutting concept. And the orange, all about the energy, is the content idea. Now the biggest difference here is when we assess this, we want to assess, can they plan an investigation that actually does this? They can't do that without understanding the science. But that's the biggest difference in what we did in the standards, is actually breaking out all 3 of those aspects. And when you talk to students about science, regardless of the program you're using, you can actually break the idea into these pieces. What do we have to be able to do? That's the practice, okay? What's the overarching theme? That's the cross-cutting concept. What's the specific detail? That's the standard, okay? So when we go into it. Now, the way we designed the program then to actually study this, because this standard right here, students look at that like we talked about earlier. It's not compelling to them why I need to know this, okay? So what we do with this is we actually laid the program out into 3 segments then. It is a module lesson program. Now when you think module, I don't know why we have to do this in publishing. Chapter is the same thing as module, it's the same thing as unit. I mean, it's just another name. Then we do the lessons. When we start a module out, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to open that module and try to get their interest, and we're going to introduce that STEM project. We're going to go into a lesson, and we're going to follow that 5E lesson plan. Now that 5E lesson plan, if you haven't used it before, is pretty unique to science. It means in any lesson, I'm going to engage my students. We're then going to do some exploration. Once we explore, that's where we come in. We're going to do the content background. That's the explain. We're going to elaborate by connecting it to the real world. And then we're going to evaluate, do they understand that performance expectation? Okay? When we finish that lesson, we're going to come back to that STEM project, do a little planning, go into my next lesson, kind of repeat the same cycle. When I finish my lessons, we're going to wrap that module up. Now, let's do an actual example that ties into that. So this is a module in the middle grades on information transfer. Now, when you get into this actual module, it looks at biology. How do people communicate with each other? It goes into some of the physics behind this that connects to it. But I want you to notice we always start out with a phenomenon. This goes to that student discourse idea we talked about. What's the big question? So how can you talk to someone when they live across the world? And then the second thing we're going to do, this goes to multiple learning styles. We have the image, we have the question. Typically what we're going to do is we're also going to connect it to some kind of animation or visual. So we're saying here's different ways to expose you to the same idea that might drive your thinking. Now, you can use any program and create phenomenon. In fact, and I haven't done it yet, but I will put this on the document. There's a free website called ngssphenomenon.org. Not com, but org. ngssphenomenon.org. I'll put the link in the handout. It's got a ton of these little short videos that you can use that are phenomenon. Phenomenon are just unusual things that happen in everyday life. Now, for our students then, the video we're going to use, this is not an explanation. There is actually no audio that goes with this. It is simply being able to look and say, let me give you, what do we mean by communicating around the world? These are ways that today we are actually sharing information across the world. Okay? I've had the privilege to come to the UAE probably over the last 10 or 11 years, multiple times, and the people I work with have become my friends. We communicate regularly across the world with WhatsApp and with some of these other things we're looking about. But the idea is, let's look at the science and how it really connects to the real world, okay? So we're going to start out with this phenomenon by doing it different methods, by having the question and allowing students discourse around it, by having the image, by having the video. There are different entry points for a student. And then what we want them to do is actually to talk about that, okay? That's where that student discourse comes into play. The other thing we do at the module I mentioned is the STEM project. Now, we just build these in because the purpose of this project is twofold. The major one, this actually is the real performance assessment about if the students understand the standard. Can you plan an investigation that does this? In this one, I want you to think of the topics that we've done here. Good grief, the coral are dying. By the way, let me ask you a question. If we think globally across the world, is this an actual issue? Yeah. Does anybody remember, some of you are way too young. Does anybody remember the ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau? Nobody? You need to Google Jacques Cousteau. They did ocean research. His ship was called the Calypso. I read a book about 2 years ago, and what they did, they went back to sites that they had visited early in their research. So like 20 years later, they came back. And the amount of sea life had decreased exponentially because of destruction of the area of the ocean near the shore because of human development. But how drastic it was. In this one, this is happening. And what students have to do is they actually have to design and create a model of an artificial coral reef. The topic they're studying is biodiversity and how biodiversity is impacted by human life. This one, looking at a volcano, the actual harmful rays that come once that ash is up in the air, and what we could do to block that. So there's research base behind it, but it's the reason we do this. Now, one thing for those of you that are using Inspire Science, I want you to know this. In one grade level, you might have 10 or 11 modules that you're going to cover in that year. I just want to tell you, don't feel like you have to do every single project. Because of the time that it takes to do this, my general guideline, in the last school I was in, we had 4 marking periods. And the way I would do that is I would pick 1 each marking period. Because I want to give them the experience of doing it to something that connects to real world and they apply the science, but you don't have to do it every time. So we introduce that right at the beginning. And then what we do is we move into the lesson. Now this is to me the meat of what we do as teachers when we're teaching. In that lesson, you're going to see these 5 E's. We're going to look at what we mean by that. But something we did uniquely in this program is before we actually get in, we do a science probe. A science probe is a way to assess student misconceptions about the topic that we're dealing with. Okay? We're not looking for students to get a right answer. We want to know what is their broad thinking about a specific topic. So let me give you an example of a probe. A probe is actually an instructional routine. So remember, with an instructional routine, the first time I use it, I explain it, I model it, we do it together. Once they know how to do it, I don't have to explain it anymore. In a probe, there are always three parts. The first thing we're doing is we're going to give the students a scenario. The second thing, they're going to make a choice. And then the third thing, they're going to defend their choice or give their rationale behind their choice. So in this one, by the way, it's on biodiversity. I probably could have picked a better example for the UAE or for the Gulf region, because in the UAE, how many forests are there that we're going to cut down? Okay? So we know that, yeah. So if I was doing this with my students, I would change the idea. I would talk about an area of the desert that we're going to develop with buildings and what happens then. But I want you to notice this. 3 students were discussing a forest near their community that has trees being cut down so the wood could be sold. And they had different ideas about what's going to happen. Here's what they said. Vicky said cutting down the forest won't threaten biodiversity in the area because the trees will grow back. If I don't build something on here, will the trees grow back? No. They actually will, but it will take a long time. And then, but what I would tell you, if we go in and cut all the trees down around it, they're not going to, you know, but you see what they've done here. They cut a section out of the middle. Yes. Now, the second student, Dariana, said cutting down the forest destroys the habitat for many different organisms and threatens biodiversity. And then, Wells says cutting down the forest won't threaten biodiversity. The organisms in that area will just move to another place to live. Circle the student you agree with most and explain your reasoning. Yes. So think about this. If I'm this student here, I could say, I think it's Vicky because the trees will grow back if we left other trees around them. And so if the trees go back, everything will be fine. What we're looking for is their misconception. Some may agree with Dariana, and then some may say, you know what, yeah, they didn't cut all the trees down. The animals will just, the animal and the organisms will just go to the next place. Okay? Now, when we think about this, though, the first thing we're doing, we want to use think, pair, share. Let the students think about this by themselves. Put them in a small group of 2 or 3. What did you come up with? Why do you think that? And then finally, let's talk about it whole group. It does 2 things. 1, what are they thinking? And now I know this. Secondly, I've allowed them a chance to have that interaction to create some engagement. Okay? These don't take long, but a couple things. Number 1, I don't tell them the best answer. We're going to wait as we study and say, does it change? Has your thinking changed? In fact, one of the things we did in the program, if you haven't ever looked at this, in the program resources, our author that writes these, Paige Keeley, has done a series of short little videos, 2 to 3 minutes long, that talk about strategies you can use to make this more engaging and meaningful for a student. Let me give you 2 examples. One, she has a strategy called the 3 corners or 4 corners. And so what I would do is I would have students look at this. If you agree with Vicky, go to that corner. If you could agree with Dariana, go here. If you agree with, well, go over here. Now, send somebody from your group to this group to convince them why you're right and they should come over here. Think about that. Another strategy we do is just called the sticky note strategy. Write down who I agree with on the yellow sticky note. Pop it up here. Halfway through what we're studying, what do you think now? Write that on the blue sticky note. Where does it go now? Has it changed or is it the same? Then when we get to the end, we do the same thing. And what you can actually see is student thinking change over time. But it gives you insight into what they're thinking. So we start out with this, really uncovering misconceptions, creating student thinking about their reasoning that goes in that, creates an opportunity when we start studying, I'm actually looking for something now. Okay? So it's some of the things we do. For you as a teacher, there's always the background behind it. Now again, let me just remind you, if you're not using Inspire Science, you can still do these. And really, if you think about it, it's an image and a scenario, a choice, and then the rationale. Yes?
Okay, but this group is for which grade?
Pardon?
This book?
Every grade. Every grade. Okay? At K5 and 6-8, we do them every lesson. At high school, we do them every unit. Okay? So it's the big overarching idea. You think about it, if it's K1, it's going to be really simple. You know, circle the best answer. You know, why do you think that? Okay? If it's 12th grade, it's going to be more complex. We then go into a lesson. Now we're in the engage part. In the engage part, we're going to introduce another phenomenon. So I'm changing subject areas on you, by the way. You guys see that. In this one, why does the temperature change in a hot and cold pack? Now, I want you to think about that. How many of you have had to use a hot or cold pack? Okay? You hold it, it's room temperature, you crush it. Yeah. Either gets hot or cold, depending on what it is. Where I live in Colorado, we're by the Rocky Mountains, and we like to go skiing. And we take those little hand warmer packs to put in our mittens so our hands don't get cold. And why does that happen? Now, when we do this, a couple things I want you to note. Okay? We're immediately going to have students start thinking and discussing about this. Okay? The second thing we're going to do is we're going to pull in some kind of other visual opportunity because it goes back to differentiating learning styles, opportunities for to see the idea in different ways, and then we do something unique in this engage part. I showed this to you earlier. This is the claim evidence reasoning. Now we differ this by grade level, and what I mean, we do it K-12. In K-5, we do it one lesson per topic. We don't do it every lesson, once per topic, and we scaffold it. So what I mean by that, I may do a sentence starter in here and make it really simple.
It's more prediction and...
Pardon?
It's more of prediction in grades 1 and 2.
Yes.
Than claim.
Yes. Okay? Because we're teaching them the skill. By the way, this is an instructional routine. Once they know what it is, I don't have to explain it. But then they go into, here's my claim about the phenomenon. And then we start going into the lessons. Now, why this is so important is a couple of reasons. One, when we study science and we do an activity, let's say we do a lab, and then we watch this video on the topic, and then we lecture some and talk about the idea, students aren't trying to take the lab and the video and us and connect it. They're just listening. Then they go in and answer questions. What this does is everything that they do, we stop and look and say, was there any evidence that we found? How does it support this? So you'll notice as they go through, continually we're going to ask for evidence. And then at a certain point, we're going to come back here and say, do you need to revise your claim? Do you need to change it?
By the way, this approach helps them to prepare for AP exams.
Absolutely.
Because most of the AP questions, they focus on claim evidence reasoning.
Yes.
They give them the claim, then they ask them to provide evidence, and then the reasoning.
In any high-stakes test, ACT, SAT, level A's, I mean, any of those assessments, they're wanting to see if you can use the information. This makes them do it, but it connects what you're doing. Now, after we do this framework, what we do is, after we make the claim, by the way, we're going to use this the whole time we're in this idea. What we do then is we immediately go into an investigation. You know what, most classes that I did, think about university science. We went to lecture, and then on another day we went to what? Laboratory. And maybe the lab matched up, maybe sometimes it didn't. But you know, generally what we did is we presented the idea, and then we did a lab to prove the idea. So to show me I'm actually right. What we're doing here is we're having students investigate whether it's hands-on. By the way, at K-5, we actually build in, we call them investigations. Some are video, some are simulation, some are data, some are hands-on. When they're doing this, we're creating the opportunity why they need to know. So what happened here? Now, let's go into the content and think about why that happened. This is so much more effective than telling them why things happen and then proving it. But when we finish this lab right here, did we find any evidence for our claim? Then I'm going to go into the explanation. And you know what? Another thing you really need to know if you're using Inspire, a lesson is not one day. A lesson may be 5 days or 7 days, because you're going to see multiple opportunities. Because one of the big changes was in GSS for us was fewer topics, deeper level of investigation. Okay? So we really went into that. So we would go into it. You're going to notice here was an opportunity to do another investigation. This time, either a PhET simulation or finding patterns through a hands-on lab. Now, if you're not, is anybody not familiar with PhET? You've not seen PhET before? Okay. If you're not, take a picture of this, because what they've done is a whole series of free interactive simulations. We embed some that match our lessons, but there's a lot of them out there that you can use. And this is what we call this one moving man. Okay? In this, we can manipulate the man. We can look at the position, the velocity, the acceleration. All of those things allow us to consider what's happening here. This is really a model. We're modeling what takes place, but I'm going to tell you what, this makes it so much more real to a student than me talking about it and doing an equation. Now, once I've done this, I can go back and do an equation and say, well, that makes sense now. In fact, I had students in my physics class that could do the math, but had no idea what that math meant. They didn't understand the science. Okay? This is another example of different learning style and differentiating, because students actually experience it in a different way. This one, when I get done, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say, is there evidence? So if you think about engage was the phenomenon and the claim evidence reasoning. Explore was the investigation. Explain was the content we looked at. Now we're going to elaborate. Let's look at how this connects to the real world. And whenever we do something like this, there's always an it's your turn. So, after I start looking at it as a teacher, if I'm not using Inspire, even if I am, I might go online and find something in the news that's happening that relates directly to the science that we're doing right now. Okay? When we get to the end of the lesson, we're going to do something that really is so important. We're going to go back to the probe and say, what do you think now? We're going to go back to the phenomenon and say, hey, can we revisit that claim? What do we think happens now? And we're going to do a little planning for the STEM project. Now, really quickly, let me take you here, okay? We would go through our lessons then, and then we come to the end of this module. And we come to the end of the module, we're going to look at the STEM project, okay? Here's the STEM project. I actually go through and do the project. It does take some time. That's why I'm saying don't feel you have to do every one. But then the students are always going to have some kind of product. And this one's a presentation. Sometimes it's design a web page that communicates your information. Sometimes it's in a scenario base, but we're going to wrap that up, and then we're going to come back to our phenomenon. That's the big one we started the topic with, or the module. And in that, notice this right here. Here's their reflection on the phenomenon, and right here, if you had to ask one question about what you studied that you don't know yet, what would it be? Could you plan and conduct an investigation around this? And by the way, even if you don't have them do the investigation, to have them think about what could I do is really big, okay? For our students to be able to look at that, kind of revisit that, and then say, how would I do this, all right? Now in high school, I'm going to touch on just two things. I'm not going to go into all this. We designed it a little bit differently. We still start with the phenomenon. We still start with a visual image and a video that goes along with it, allowing them to have different impacts. But there's two strategies that we use here in high school that you could use in other grade levels. One we introduce, it's an instructional routine. It's called the driving question board. So when I ask the phenomenon, what other questions could you ask about this? What else could you wonder about this idea? Okay? I write those on a sticky note, or I put them on something digital like a Padlet, or they actually have a free digital site called Lino, L-I-N-O, that looks just like this. It's a board, and the students can actually stick virtual sticky notes on it. So we put the questions up there. As we're teaching, and we're investigating, and we're doing our claim evidence reasoning, we're going to come across the answers to some of these questions. And we're going to take that and move it over to the answered side. You know what that does? That gives students some ownership into the learning, and when they see one of their questions answered, that's pretty impactful for them. Another way you could do instead of claim evidence reasoning is called the summary table. Notice, what are we doing? Did we observe any evidence that goes back to our claim? Is there any explanation for it? Did we get any questions answered? So for the whole big idea, it becomes kind of a longitudinal chart of our learning that we can use. So just a couple ideas. When we think about differentiation, we really do need to think about language support. We've tried to add that in the program, but I'm going to only highlight one right here. Let me skip ahead just a minute. When we think about investigations, there are two great ways to differentiate. One of these is by task. So if I have a group of 3 or 4 doing the investigation, who's the timekeeper? Who's the facilitator making sure we're working through that lab? Who's the recorder? Yes, and that was one way to do it. The other way to differentiate in your lab is we try to make a suggestion with the labs, especially in primary, but you'll also see this in the middle grade. But really, it's a strategy. Number one, some students just need it really structured. It's exactly what we're doing, okay? Caution with structured. Sometimes students follow the steps, but don't look for any meaning behind the steps. So you got to probe for that information. The second one is more guided. Make the prediction before what do you think is going to happen when we do this? And now when we do the investigation, it's not so much every single, I have to stand. I'm going to let them do it. And then the third one is more open. And this is where maybe instead of doing it like this, I have them come up with an investigation that looks at the same idea. But it actually levels that material for students when we go in. And then this is one I want you to jot down or take a picture of. This is called Actively Learn. It's something new that we've recently done. There is a free version of this, so even if you're not using McGraw Hill, even if you don't have this right now, you can use it. What it is, it's really for the elaborate part. We add science articles to this that are related to the standards, and we add them every day of not every day, every week. Every week we'll add a couple new articles broken down by biology, physics, chemistry, by grade level, by lexile level. And it's a really unique reading experience. It chunks the reading for the student. But there is nothing more powerful in science than bringing in an activity or an article or a video that's real world related to what they're studying. Okay? So this is called Actively Learn. When you go in as a teacher, again, just search it. There's a free version that you can use. The only thing you can't do in the free version is assign it, but you can use it with your students, okay?
Is there a specific link to access these articles, or I should just write Actively Learn?
Just search Actively Learn.
Actively Learn McGraw Hill.
Yep.
I can find all the articles.
Yeah, it'll actually take you to the site and you can sign up and then you can get the articles that are in there, okay? So really what we think about, when you think about science, we want to focus on the 3 dimensions of the learning, the practices, and you know what? Ideally, at the end of the year, the students know what the practices are. And in fact, it wouldn't be a bad idea at every grade level to put up on a chart, here are the 8 practices, and to be asking, did we use any practices in this investigation? Secondly, design for the students and really pulling in those instruction routines. So this is the last comment I'm going to make. If you guys are okay, I'll just say one comment on assessment. But this is the thing. The reason these, like student discourse, did we see any student discourse in the last 20 minutes? Any opportunity for students to talk?
All of it.
All the time, right? Around the phenomenon and the probe and the, I mean, that discourse is built in. Did we see any routines? The science probe is a routine. The claim evidence reasoning is a routine. The driving question board is a routine. Actually, the revisiting the probe, the revisiting the phenomenon is a routine that we work with. And then this last piece on assessment, I'm just going to show you one slide. I'm going to skip one and show you one. This one's the one I want to hear. What we've done, that STEM project is kind of the performance assessment. But the other one we've done, and this is in there, guys, at the program level, there's a piece in the program called the 3D assessment guide. You can print questions or they're in the test generator as well. But the point with this, we're starting to ask questions that look for more than level 1 memorization response. So it's what you said about the AP test. These questions are, here's the situation. Now, we've got a multi-part question that deals with this that the student has to think through. Because we're not looking just for content, we're looking for what they can do with the content. By the way, again, if you don't have this, there are lots of questions that are available online that you could pull on your topic that are really more performance-based type questions. This is still, some of this is still multiple choice, but it has students really going into deeply in the idea. So that's really why, there we go, these pieces are so important. And even if you're not using Inspire Science, you can still do a probe. You can still use phenomenon with your lesson. You can still use claim evidence reasoning. You can still grab articles that elaborate the use of the science in the real world. So with that, I'm going to challenge you to think about one thing we talked about today that you haven't been doing, or maybe you need to do in a different way, and use it. And then for those of you that are using Inspire Science, whether in the room or online, I hope one thing you see is a little bit more of the purpose of why we do these things and why they're built into the program. So with that, I'm going to stop.